my friends who are coming of age and graduating and everybody else. One of the skills they don't teach you in seminary is how to cut your remarks on the fly. And so this is an experiment. How many sermons about Ross Perot do you ever hear? My assumption is that for most of you, the answer is 0, especially in a Unitarian church, and that for our coming-of-age students and high school students, you probably don't hear much about Ross Perot at all, or even know about him, apart from his name being on a museum in town. Not that he was a disruptive third-party presidential candidate or a successful business mogul. But I was reading about a decade ago in our national magazine, Texas Monthly, about his life story. And one thing I didn't know about him was that after he was famous for becoming a billionaire, I didn't know that he grew up poor in Texarkana during the Depression. And his house was just a few blocks away from the main set of train tracks in town. And in an interview that he was doing with somebody trying to get a little of his biography, he told a story about his mother's values and how they imparted on his life. They lived 6 or 7 blocks from the main set of train tracks in town, and during the Depression, there was a wave of usually men riding trains from town to town searching for work, often carrying a small set of belongings with them. And their house was a place where these guys came all the time. Every few days, somebody would knock on the door and ask for a meal, a place to rest, maybe something to help them get a little bit on the way. And even though their family had next to nothing already, Ross Perot's mom would invite these men in and feed them and give them a little money, as much as she could give at the time, and send them on their way. But this became a regular occurrence. Every few days, another person would knock on the door, having taken the train, and ask for help. And finally, one of the men said, "Do you want to know why so many people are coming to your house?" And she said, "Well, yes, of course." And he took her outside and showed her a mark on the curb outside of their house, a circle with an X drawn in it. And that was because somebody had identified them as an easy mark, which means basically, I can ask you for something and you'll give it to me without asking too many questions. And the person had put in a circle with an X in the middle of it with chalk on their curb as an identifier that if you went to their house, they would help you. And so the young Ross Perot went to go fetch a bucket of water and a rag and said, "Mom, do you want me to go ahead and wash that mark off of the curb?" And she said, "Absolutely not." They left that mark, an X with a circle around it, on their house for as long as they were in that house. And even in his office today, there is on the wall an X with a circle around it to remind him of the visible mark that his family left to the people who were coming in from out of town looking for something to eat. So this is a day in which either you're graduating from high school or coming of age, or for a number of reasons in church together, thinking about transitions in our lives. And I can't help thinking that in some fashion, the liberal church, and ours included, gives you the idea, even though we try really hard not to, gives you the idea that the mark of your spiritual maturity is that you now have opinions. We've tried our best to get this out of our system, to design these programs such that that's not the case. But if you take a class in adult education or you coming of age, the thing that you almost always do at the end is tell us what you think, as if that is the marker of having grown up and become spiritually mature, whether you're 14 or 18 or 98. The fact of the matter is, unless you hold a huge amount of power in the community you're in, the system you're in, the family you're in, the country you're in, most people don't learn all that much from your opinion, or don't seek it out. Most people learn about who you are, what you value, what you love, where your heart lies, where your God is, what you have most trust in, what you love in the deep recesses of your hearts. Most people know what that is by watching your actions. And I wish that wasn't the case, because that's really challenging. It's extremely challenging. Most people know what you love, who your God is, what you have faith in, not by asking for your opinion. It's very rare that you say, I hope my child grows up and falls in love with someone who's always right. Oh, you're going to love this new person who's a part of our friend group. They have the best opinions. When do we hear that? You hear, you're going to love them. They're so kind. They're so generous. They're so loving. They work for justice. They have compassion. They exude joy. Here's the frightening thing about the fact that people know you by your actions and not your beliefs. That there's always a gap between our interior life and our actions. Almost always, at least there is for me. I go about the world thinking I'm one person. I'm super duper, by the way. I'm great. I'm loving, I'm compassionate, I'm patient, I'm kind, I'm wise, and then I have to leave the house, and usually it happens even before then, and be a person in the presence of other people, and then there's this gap between the person I think I am, super great, and the actions I have, almost always a little less than that. Some days way less than that. And assuming that I'm not the only imperfect manifestation of possibility in the room, I will just assume that you're in the same boat. Sometimes it's so much the case that it's like there's two people moving through the world. I look in the mirror, you look in the mirror, and you know yourself to just be a really good, loving, decent person. Or you know that you really strive for perfection and you're hard on others because it's important to get things right. But if you're just a jerk about it, all people see is you being a jerk. They rarely get to see your interior life in the way that you do. And so, we kind of have to go through the world not ever really fully being known, even to the people who love us the most. There's the person staring out of your eyes, then there's the person everybody else sees. There's almost always this little gap. It's being human. Grace is what fills in the gap. So we could emphasize over and over and over that we want you to be smart and right and kind and have the highest SAT scores and the most voter-registered denomination in the history of the United States. But really the goal is that you're a people who experiences deep and meaningful relationships with God, yourself, others, and the earth. Done through actions that have integrity with your values and compensated for by your astounding capacity for grace. Grace means getting to know and love human beings even when the gap between their interior life and actions is pretty big. Grace is admitting that everyone else faces the same kind of thing you do. We all look into the mirror and say, who's that? There's just always a gap. If you want to find out whether you're following a good spiritual teacher, go to lunch with them and see what happens when the waiter doesn't bring the meal correctly. Or when the lowest paid person in the school or the hospital is in front of them. Or when they're in traffic. These are really good indicators of spiritual progress that have very little to do with opinions. What it means, though, is that if we cultivate the capacity for grace, we get to know and be known in our imperfection. Does that make sense? We get to know and be known in our imperfection, which isn't going away. It isn't going away. We inherited from our tradition the God of the universalists who just doesn't keep score. And that was so offensive to people when that idea came out. What do you mean God doesn't keep score? Do I have to love everybody? Oh my God, I don't want to love everybody. There's all these follow-up questions that come right after that. And I don't think you do have to love everybody. I don't know if that's possible. But I do think that coming out of a tradition that emphasizes that the foundation of reality itself isn't keeping track of your mistakes puts some responsibility on us, but only if you want to call yourself a Unitarian Universalist. If you don't, that's fine. But if you do, the responsibility for grace is just astounding. There's a man in the 1600s named Brother Lawrence. When he was 18 years old, he was walking along one day and saw this barren tree in the wintertime. It was completely stripped of all of its leaves. It looked lifeless and dead. And as he was walking along, he thought to himself, in a few months, that tree is going to have leaves all over it, and blossoms and flowers. God knows that it's more than its dead branches. And he had what was a religious conversion at age 18. And he joined a Carmelite monastery and became Brother Lawrence. And his job in the monastery was kitchen duty. And so what he did was peel potatoes like nobody had ever peeled potatoes in the history of the world. In fact, he peeled potatoes with such presence, like a prayer, because he believed that a loving God was in all things. He peeled potatoes so prayerfully that people would come from hundreds of miles away to watch Brother Lawrence peel potatoes. They'd go, "Get a load of this guy. Come here, you got to check out his potato peeling. It's amazing." They would go on pilgrimages to watch Brother Lawrence carefully and meditatively peel potatoes and sweep the floor and wash the tables and put the plates away. Not because he was really good at washing tables, certainly not because he was right about potatoes, but because his presence pointed to something bigger than himself. It pointed to a loving God that was in all places and all people. Just by watching this guy work, people experienced the love and presence of the creator of the universe itself, and they were in awe. His mark of where his heart was, just like the Perot family, was his life. So our job, our call, is to be people who can do both. People who can live with radical integrity. Daniel often says to newcomers, we hope that we are who we say we are. Our job is to be people who, on the one hand, can have our mark of what we love, what we worship, what we follow, be the lives we lead. So you can tell just by watching what is important to us. And at the very same time, be people who will love others when they're falling short of the same goal. It means having the mark on your curb and not judging your neighbor for not having the mark on theirs. All at the same time. I have no assurance that people are going to come knocking on your door to see if you're generous. I have probably little faith that any of us is going to have people travel from hundreds of miles away to watch us peel potatoes. But I do know that they're learning whether or not you believe in love by watching you. I know that they're learning whether we're actually generous by watching us, whether we're actually inclusive people, whether we're actually people of grace, whether we actually believe in a diverse, multicultural community, whether we're actually intent on building heaven on earth, not by what we say, but by watching whether our actions match up. And I do know that people are drawn to people of grace. People who can see them for more than their mistakes. People who believe in possibility hidden in plain sight. And so if you can be responsible and be filled with grace, people might just run from hundreds of miles away to be in your presence. Because your daily life will point towards something holy and good that moves in all things. May it be so, and amen.